Chair, but I think you made the motion to go to the 250, and I voted with you on that, but
I think I did. And so that's kind of what I was like, what was the conversation behind that? And I was trying to look back at my notes on that, Commissioner Metzer.
yeah, I mean, I know that I had very convincing information that I wasn't comfortable with reductions on the marine, natural, and conservancy, and the natural wasn't even proposed, so that really was an issue. So my main focus, honestly, was the marine conservancy in terms of any concerns that I had with Planning Commission recommendation, and because there was a significant reduction proposed, it was out of line with the input we had from Fish and Wildlife. It was you know, a little bit out of step with information on, you know, near shore salmon issues that I deal with. And so I wanted to address that, but you know, exactly where it had to go was a topic that we discussed, you know, together as a board, and that's where we landed. So can you, if just theoretically, if 250 were made 200, is there a practical, can you explain what that would mean on the ground? Like, given that there's this shoreline jurisdiction area that's designated?
I think we would have to look at, and it's the reason that the board was considering and is able to consider something larger than that base 200-foot jurisdiction has to do with, you know, authorizations that are within the Shoreline Management Act or Mass Management Act, and also decisions the board can make to expand jurisdiction, you know, in the presence of a critical area, for example. So in the case where, so you have a lot of these areas out there that today are 250. If you wanted to build today, that's your buffer is 250. What we would have to examine is, yes, those shorelines are technically, they are shorelines as well as critical areas. So we would need to go back and look at, in the case of a buffer that was 200 feet under shorelines, does that mean that that outer 50 feet remains regulated by critical areas, or does that go away because they're technically shorelines as well as critical areas? So we'd have to look at that. I would say there's two outcomes. One would be that the buffer is just 200 instead of 250. The second outcome is the first 200 feet is regulated by shorelines and the last 50 is regulated by critical areas, which is the whole point of, you know, bringing the buffers necessary to protect critical areas into shoreline jurisdiction so that you don't end up with one property being subject to both, where, you know, shoreline says it's okay, but critical areas says it's not, or you're putting it so half the house is in one versus the other, and trying to avoid those sort of situations where we need to make those interpretations.
But right now you say we have that situation.
We do, yeah. So the critical areas ordinance currently controls the buffers for these areas. Because that, back when the critical areas ordinance was adopted in 2012, that took over. There was state law that said if you're updating your critical areas ordinance, you can apply that to shoreline areas until your shoreline update comes around. And that's the door the county walked through back then. So it's very confusing.
Whoever did the last shoreline update did not believe that having 250, which is what's on the books, was some sort of transgression of a limitation of 200 feet.
I'm sorry, say that, the last shoreline?
Yeah, I mean,
The current.
In the 1990.
The argument that was made to me, the argument that we had, not argument, but the discussion we had with the Planning Commission chair was that, he argued, I believe, that we couldn't go, you know, 200 feet, that's it, you're limited. So it's.
And I think that was actually the question that was asked by the board to take to our legal counsel. And what they said is it is within the purview of the board to make that decision.
And ecology. So there had been a shift in my understanding from ecology. So, you know, when the Planning Commission was looking at these things, I think that was the prevailing thought, was that 200 feet was the cap. Because, you know, earlier versions of the draft had said 250, and when the Planning Commission was looking at those buffers, you know, like, well, why would we go more than 200? We can't do that. And that had been sort of backed up by ecology, or them saying, you know, we're not sure you can go beyond 200. But since that time, I've been told by their staff that the county may have larger buffers than 200 feet if that is, you know, justified based on our local conditions of our shorelines. And So, has the final thing been said on that? Of course not, because it's gonna go to ecology and it's gonna get routed around, but my operating understanding at this time is that the county may, if it chooses to, have buffers larger than 200 feet.
I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know what facility you have with the bazillion pieces of paper involved in public comment and stuff on this, but do you happen to have access to the letter we got toward the, I want to say, this summer from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, specifically on the buffers?
I could find that, yeah.
I only ask because I feel like that was, at least Commissioner Mejia is kind of asking where, kind of where we landed. I think that had pretty persuasive effect for me personally, just so I sharing that with her.
I think, and what I remember from DFW's perspective was, they are promoting the site potential tree height methodology, where you look at what's the largest tree that would grow in this area, or the height of that tree. That should be your buffer, because we know that when those trees fall over, they provide inputs to the waterways. And I think what their comments were is that, earlier drafts of the SMP had options for buffers, and we think that this option over here is closest to what our preferred methodology would be. And that was the 85 and then 250 for the others. So that's what I.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I know we've spent a lot of time talking about site potential tree height, and it wasn't something we were just gonna, adopt at this point, because there's a lot of work being done on that, but it seemed to me like that's where we're headed. I think in the science, we're gonna end up with some permutation of that. So to have a more standardized set of buffers, traditional, I'll say, set of buffers that was not out of sync with that made sense to me. So we're not setting ourselves up for
Having to make changes.
being out of compliance, the next update.
Yeah, it's not currently a requirement, but it
No, I
very well
understand
may,
that.
it very well
I
may be
understand
in
that,
future,
but,
future rulemakings, sure. Yeah, so as we're talking, I can see if I can find that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So we're gonna put a pin in that for now on buffers, or?
Commissioner Mejia, in your discussion, did it sound like that the property owner you were discussing this with, did they not want to deal with the time and expense of a variance process, or did they not think it applied to them at all, or did they not bring that up and maybe don't know how that's going to potentially help their situation?
The third option. We didn't really discuss the variance. We just mostly stuck with the buffer piece of things, the fairness piece of it, and kind of how we landed there. And I brought it up because I was like, okay, like, was there anything in my thought process, right, where when we made that decision that was like off, or, did I look at information? So I just really appreciate kind of talking through this, because, I was like, I remember there was a reason why we decided to go with the 250, but I just was trying to figure out like exactly why, besides just where we landed with other jurisdictions. I was like, there was more to that piece, I remember, but I just couldn't quite place my finger on it.
Yeah, and I mean, just going way back, there's, we've looked at like scientific information that staff had provided from the original draft, and there's, depending on where you're at and what the considerations are, I know certain staff have argued to me that, there's an argument that 400 feet is, for certain marine designations, is really a good number, but that's long, that's big, and you find a more reasonable middle ground. And so
Yeah, you could take it further, depending if you wanted to account for the life cycles of all types of critters that we know use these areas. You'd be talking 1/4 mile or something like that. But we know that it's The buffers that go forward in a master program are a distillation of the best available science and trying to come up with an approach that is going to cover most functions in most areas and also allow reasonable use of property, because that's also a directive that the county has to ensure that we protect.
So what did you bring up?
So what I brought up is that letter from DFW that came to us in July, came to me and then was shared with the board. And so, yeah, this is what Commissioner Menzer was referring to. So let me see here. So they talk about that current best available science supports their use of the site potential tree height, which is the methodology they're putting forward. And then that the buffer widths that were proposed at the time fall below the buffer widths identified in some of the documents that we know are best available science, and that they're recommending that the county select, the larger buffer options which had been put forward in the Planning Commission public hearing. So I think this definitely was driving that conversation that the board had back then.
Yeah, this is, and I read a lot of stuff from a lot of folks and a lot of it's good information, but I thought this was kind of a good distillation of the considerations at play, and this is where I ended up heading with my position.
So do we feel comfortable with the buffer widths that are in the current draft?
Mature on the.
Or you mean what the board has
Yeah,
decided
sorry.
over the last several,
Yeah,
Commissioner?
Yeah.
Yep, okay.
thank you.
Okay, so we'll proceed with the previous decisions made by the board.
And maybe we could ask, I know the individual that was, raising these concerns, and if we could reach out to that person and just make sure they understand how the variances work and how it might help, because what they described in public comment sounded, and I know there's always there's nuances, so I'm not trying to say that they can be,
Yeah.
but just so they know that there's this process in place, because it sounded like exactly the situation they were describing.
And you know who?
Mhm.
Okay,
I've
yes, we can
I've
contact
done
them.
that, but I can go back and look and make sure that there's nothing else that they're looking
Maybe
for.
let the commission, just for our education, let the commissioners know, if it turns out that that doesn't work for them and stuff, let us know, just so we have an understanding of how this operates on the ground.
That would be great. Thank you.
Can do. Thank you. All right. Does not every time. Great. So the next issue we'll look at is the shoreline environment designations on Pattison Lake for one parcel out there. So earlier in the year, the board reviewed several requests from landowners who wanted the board to reconsider the proposed shoreline environment designation on their property. In short, shoreline environment designation, or SED, is based on how a given area has been developed and what ecological functions it has, among other factors. And that SED controls the type of development that can occur in a given area, as well as what the buffer would be and other permit and development standards. So this is sort of a real world example of the conversation or continuation of the conversation you just had. The board made decisions on 3 of these requests back earlier this summer, and then asked staff to circle back with the landowner to review 1 request on Pattison Lake. So what we're talking about here is the wooded parcel here that you can see at the top of the screen. And it's owned by the same family that owns the developed parcel that's highlighted here. So they have proposed a split designation for that wooded parcel, with the portion closest to the developed property being shoreline residential and a portion of it being natural. Originally, their concern had been that the entire thing was to be designated natural, and they did not believe that that matched the pattern of development out there.
And it's currently split.
It's currently split as well, yes, thank you.
Because there's something on the corner there that.
Yeah, there's a corner of it that's currently rural, which is a walk across or shoreline residential, same thing essentially. And then the balance of it, I think, is conservancy currently. So they have had the property surveyed, which the county can use to make changes in the GIS system. And they've submitted a sketch of what that proposed split designation would be. And so we're circling back to the board to get feedback and approval on the SEDs for this property. And what you can see up there now is a proposed split designation in the image on the left. and this was submitted by the landowner. And then again, for orientation to the right is the parcel aerial photograph. So the wooded parcel is the one we're talking about there. So I'll pause there, because yeah, the decision point for the board essentially is just seeking confirmation if we should move forward with the proposed split between shoreline residential and natural environment.
Questions, Commissioner Munster?
Okay, I don't have my notes handy for that last meeting, but currently you said it's conservancy?
Mhm.
It's going up, it's being graded up or graded down, however we look at that, to natural?
Change to natural, based on that inventory and characterization process that I described earlier. Yeah, this would have originally been back in 2013 when they looked at this, said this parcel and additional areas should be natural. But you know, what we've seen through this public process is people asking us to take a more precise look at their specific situation.
Okay, and we already have a split, you said, between conservancy and residential.
Correct.
So if I know before you were like playing with the maps and showing the designation, but if is the same, so when I'm looking at this little drawing, it looks like a bigger area than what is currently split. Is that true?
Yes, I believe so. And I think that's based on the area out there that has been kind of converted to residential use with the access trails down to the shoreline, the dock itself, landscaping, and you know, then the area where they are intending to continue those uses over time. So that what you see there is a reflection of the conditions as of today that the landowner put forward.
So I know that we were talking about, like it was, if I remember this right, there was like what planning commission had, there was what the property owner kind of wanted, but in the course of a protracted discussion amongst the board, and we kind of came up with another idea, and maybe Josh was, I don't know, I can't remember, there was another idea
Yeah.
that wasn't quite either one of those two.
Right.
And then is that what this is, or is this more back to what the property owner wanted from the get-go?
I think originally, if I'm remembering correctly, the property owner wanted a split designation that was essentially close to what there is today. So split between shoreline residential and conservancy. Other options for the board were to, you know, leave it natural or make the whole thing urban conservancy. And I think it was the board who originally said, well, what if we did, you know, a portion of it shoreline residential, a portion of it natural, essentially a compromise between what the landowner wanted and what the proposal had been to make the whole thing natural.
Yeah, because what I didn't want was like 3 different designations like that.
Yeah.
I wanted it to just be, you know, boom and boom, so it's cleaner.
Yeah,
And this is that.
this is the result of that because, yeah, the board
So I just
said,
want to make
the
sure.
board said, go back to the landowner, talk it over with them,
Okay.
get their position on this proposal and come back to the board. And so this is the result of having those conversations. And this would be the proposal that we're putting forward and seeking decision.
It's an on-the-ground implementation of the board's direction. We just wanted to get confirmation of that split since it is a little bit different than the current split.
It's a bigger amount, I can see that, but I thought this was probably the best overall approach, but I don't know. What do you think, Commissioner?
So this is just in conversations with the landowner where we landed?
Yeah, this is where, yes, staff working with them and understanding what their goals are out there and, you know, what they put forward is the area that's being used for residential uses in conjunction with the house and everything they've got developed on the other parcel. This would capture that. Because it's worth noting that both their developed home parcel and everything that continues around that side of the lake is also proposed to be shoreline residential. So they're asking that this designation reflect how they're using the property today and intend to use it into the future.
Okay. Could you pull it up on the map?
Yeah, sure. And we also do have the landowner in the audience, just for the record,
Thank you.
if you have any specific questions for him. Just give me a moment and I will get that up for you.
You've gotten me used to the other map, so I'm looking at this one
Yeah.
and my brain is trying to compute it.
That one's good.
And one of the requests in the context of the survey was it's really hard from the aerial to see what's on the ground.
Yeah.
And so the survey was able to show us all of the different trails and public access points there underneath the trees,
Personal access.
personal
Yeah.
access. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so this is that wooded parcel in question, and so you can see currently, this is the designation where there is a split. This is from the 1990 SMP. What was proposed back in 2013 was that the entire thing become natural. And essentially, the proposal today would be kind of a compromise between all of that, to where there's a larger piece that would potentially be shoreline residential, but the remainder of the property would be natural, which would be, a higher level of protection.
Can you kind of point out where that shoreline residential cuts off, like?
Yeah, the proposal would be, if I had to eyeball it, would be somewhere in there.
Okay,
You have survey
Yeah,
information that
they have
supports
survey
that.
data, and so what we've asked is if, pending the board's decision, that they would submit that data and we can use that to actually create that line so that it can be located in the future. If there was, say, some development proposed or something like that, we would know, what rules apply where, essentially. So, and that's, yeah. I'll leave it there.
I'm okay with this. Let's do it. I mean, it's not like there's already an upgrade happening, so to speak, on the other upper part of the parcel, and we already have a split. It's not like we're creating a split for a particular property owner. It's kind of, in a sense, it's the status quo, but
And the
Giving them-
line of where the split is occurring is more reflective of what's on the ground.
right. So I think since we've gotten to this point and all this work's been done, let's just
yeah.
make that happen.
Okay, so we'll move forward with what we shared with the split between the natural and the shoreline residential. Back to the presentation.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Okay, 2 down, 4 more to go.
2 down, 3 pieces to go, yes. Okay, so the next item we're gonna look at here is one of the remaining decision matrix items that the board did not complete at the last briefing. The board asked for staff to bring this back. I did go back and look at how I characterized it last time, and I think I've got a more clear way to communicate it this time. So essentially, this has to do with how the draft SMP describes the situations where you can reduce a buffer and how you would do that. The previous draft really wasn't clear, and as it was written, would have been a challenge to implement. So changes were made to the board's public hearing draft to improve clarity, better describe when those buffer reductions are authorized, and close the gaps in implementation, and make these provisions more consistent with state requirements. So the overall organization of this section of the document was improved with the board's public hearing draft, and the permit requirements were more clearly laid out. So the changes make it clear that buffer reductions are authorized in limited circumstances only and would be the minimum necessary to accommodate the proposed use. We did get 2 public comments on this piece, one supporting the Planning Commission's recommendations and one encouraging the board not to reduce buffers below what we have today or to not allow any non-essential buffer reductions. So really on this one, similar to all the other items that we brought back last time, we're just looking for direction on whether to move forward with the changes that were made for the public hearing draft, or if there is further discussion or questions on that item.
Was this something we discussed at the last work
Yeah.
session?
It was.
Yeah, I think it was, I don't think I was communicating it very clearly, it was part of the issue. Yeah, this was one item that was from the decision matrix, and it's just,
At 10:30 on.
yeah. So what went forward to the board's public hearing hopefully is more clear, better, easier to implement, and is more consistent with state statute. It was changed based on comments and conversations with the Department of Ecology, and we're just seeking if there's any additional questions or anything from the board, or if we can move forward with as drafted.
I don't see that I wrote anything about this, which is probably why I'm not remembering it very well.
I know Commissioner Edwards had questions on the average for other properties, and so we skipped this item. But that's all I have on mine.
Right, yeah, he did have some questions about that, so, you know, we would be prepared to speak to that, but he's also not present, so I can share some pieces of that. So I think he mentioned buffer averaging, which is one topic, and then there's common line setback, which is another topic. So I think from the conversation, what he was referencing was the ability for people to, you know, if you've got one neighbor on one side with a house close to the water and one neighbor on the other side with a house close to the water, that potentially you would be able to site your home closer to the water than the buffer provisions would normally allow, essentially to have equity with what the neighbors have. And that is not a concept that is currently in the draft. It's not really a concept that's supported by science. You know, if you have a undeveloped shoreline that doesn't have those impacts, you know, there's not a way in the science to justify that essentially. But it is certainly a topic that the board could consider. The other piece would be the buffer averaging, which is what I thought he meant. And that's where you reconfigure a buffer on a property and maybe it's smaller somewhere where it's less sensitive and you increase it somewhere else where you're protecting something that's more, you know, sensitive to disturbance. So it's that flexibility so two different types of flexibility that you might think of when you hear the word buffer reduction. I think those were the pieces that he was interested in.
I completely understand what you just said, because I couldn't even really follow what Commissioner Edwards was proposing, because he's obviously heard of it and I hadn't, but now I get it. So is there anywhere that's used that kind, I mean, I've never heard of such an approach. Is that something that they've used different places? So you can go closer as long as you increase it? Like you
Yeah.
could have this.
So think about it this way, you have an area that's maybe it's non-native vegetation or something like that, and you have a different portion of the property that's, you know, approaching old growth conditions or is adjacent to a stream that goes into the sound or something like that, and potentially, and you want to get yourself closer to the water. You know, if the conditions warrant it, potentially you could get yourself closer in an area that's already impacted and is not really providing that level of function, in exchange for having greater protection on something else. So that is a concept that jurisdictions are able to explore with their SMPs. There's maybe one other one that I looked at that's done it. So it is an option for jurisdictions to explore. Same thing with the common line setback. It's all part of the decision-making process.
So implicit in that scheme is that there's inadequate protection for areas that, you know, could therefore benefit by giving away some protection over here because there's inadequate protection over there.
Yeah,
And the point seems to me that we ought to have adequate protection so that we don't need to make those kind of trades.
I think under that scenario, there would probably be mitigation required because you are getting closer to the water. But I mean, yeah, I would say what you described should certainly factor into the decision-making as well.
But that's not anything Planning Commission ever discussed or.
Not that I can recall.
I'm not-
No.
I personally am not we're so close to getting,
I think
I don't want to completely change even if I was convinced that was an awesome idea, I'd say let's put that front and center for the next draft.
Mhm.
Because that's not something we've ever had any public input on.
I would agree, as we were talking about it and we looked into other jurisdictions, it would involve talking about the mechanics of it, talking about the process around it. It would be a pretty big change at this stage in the process, but that doesn't mean that it can't be considered for future iterations or updates. But sort of figuring out how the current provisions work and the current processes work, and then you can always introduce that is another level of, or option for flexibility.
And that was the planning commission recommendation language?
I don't
Right.
remember, and I went back and I asked Brad, who was on this project before me, I don't know that it was ever discussed or put forward as an option. It's a blind spot for me. In my time with the planning commission, I don't believe it was discussed, and that was, 2 to 3 years worth of working with them on these items. It may have incidentally or tangentially, but I don't remember substantive discussions or conversations about changing the draft to insert those things, for example. So,
Yeah, and that also means we don't have any feedback from the Department of Ecology on those provisions, so it would be a pretty big addition at this point.
But I think it's also, if I recall, part of Commissioner Edwards' prior comments, that if there is something of like this concept that hadn't been part of this process, it doesn't mean that the board couldn't docket a particular look at this process at some future date for incorporation.
Yeah.
So it's not, because of where we are in this journey, it may be probably too late to really do a thoughtful approach, but it could be something that the board puts into the mix of items to be docketed at some future date, most likely after ecology is actually adopted.
So that comment segues to a comment I was gonna make later, and I'll make it now, or a question now. So us approving this plan, once it comes back from ecology, doesn't lock down all these provisions for the next however many years till the next update. There can be the board could say, like, for example, one of the things that we put into place was in this draft is a Marine Resources Council, Commission, Committee, whatever, and they're gonna make, they're gonna try to create metrics around no net loss and all that, and if their data or analysis shows that we're falling short, we can make targeted changes at this plan, or is everything locked down until you do another comprehensive SMP review?
So specifically, the Aquatic Resources Committee has to do with the no net loss monitoring. That specific section of the draft is written so that it's essentially gonna be applied after the fact. And so the county can make changes to how they're doing that specific piece under the authorization provided by the draft. But if that committee comes back and said, you need to change something in the SMP specifically, that's gonna have to be docketed and go through.
Well,
the
yeah,
whole-
docketed
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
So it'd be a
But I
con-
just mean it could be done like as county manager said,
Yeah. Yes,
and
off
probably up,
cycle for the SMP review.
right, I believe so.
yeah, and it would probably be great to get a year or two of implementation and see what it looks like, and then docket sort of a larger package of updates to respond to, you know.
Your metrics are always, you're looking back on sort of what has been permitted to understand sort of what those projects have and relative to potential impacts. And so you gather all that and then see whether or not you're maintaining ground or gaining ground, or would then suggest a mid-cycle change.
So then, I guess I understood it last meeting and now I'm like trying to catch up again. But looking at our list, right, basically where ecology was like as written, this section is not implementable. So then what is the decision point here? Is it to,
Whether to move forward with those improvements that were made to the document. So this is just like all the other decision points that the board went through is, we made this change, we showed you what that change is in that matrix, and then the board is going through and confirming we wanna keep that or we wanna do something else.
okay,
Yeah, this was just the last of the 16 items that, did not get completed last time.
Oh, so this is part of the,
last,
okay,
Yeah.
thank you for that
Yep.
clarification.
Yep.
So this came from something that was a suggestion of ecology.
Mhm.
With changes, okay. Yeah, I would need a lot more information to go some different direction at this point in terms of what the averaging and all that stuff. That's a whole different, I think, way of going about things that I'm not comfortable with at this point, but something we could dock it up and look at if we want to.
Sure.
yeah.
We'll move forward with the languages forward in public hearing draft.
Sure.
Okay. All right, so the next item we're gonna look at is shoreline jurisdiction and the flood of record and 100-year floodplain. So this item is related to public comments received by Alex Nielsen and his representatives. Alex's family owns the Holroyd gravel mine in the Nisqually Valley. They made some comments on how the draft SMP incorporates what's known as the flood of record into the shoreline master program. Currently, the draft SMP brings several critical areas that are in the vicinity of shorelines into shoreline jurisdiction, as we've discussed. This includes what's known as the flood of record elevation. So it's the highest known flood elevation that goes beyond the FEMA floodplain in many cases, but it's locally developed data that we have as to where flood hazards exist in the county. These areas are already regulated by the Critical Areas Ordinance and Title 14 or Chapter 1438, the Flood Code. The intent of bringing them into shoreline jurisdiction would be to ensure that there's one permitting system for properties that contain both shorelines and critical areas, so that we don't have a patchwork where some flood areas are regulated by the SMP, some of them are regulated by another program. And so the comments that we received expressed concern on the amount of area that this represents that's coming into shoreline jurisdiction, especially in areas that are further from the water body itself. So what you're seeing here in the picture is the portion of the Nisqually Valley where the Holroyd mine is located. So I'm gonna kind of circle the area of concern here. It's this triangular portion you can see here. And I apologize that these layers don't come off as clearly as I would have hoped, but the area that's in blue crosshatch is the 100-year floodplain, and that's the majority of what you're seeing here is what we're looking at, this 100-year floodplain, which is also proposed to be included in shoreline jurisdiction. And then the teal areas that are kind of on the outside here, you see these little pockets of teal, that's the flood of record elevation. And so it extends beyond the floodplain, is also proposed to be included. Including the flood of record in SMP jurisdiction and including the entire floodplain for that matter, do go beyond the minimum state requirements for SMPs. Again, the goal in doing that and trying to bring these areas together is to provide a single regulatory layer to all the frequently flooded areas that we regulate versus having two permit systems in play.
What did planning commission say about this?
They didn't really have a protracted conversation about this. To my memory, we had some kind of conceptual conversations about how critical areas are coming into shoreline jurisdiction, but they didn't really have a lot of substantive conversation on it that I recall. So now that we've kind of given that little bit of background, the board really has two decision points in front of them. The board can proceed with SMP jurisdiction as mapped, or they could remove the flood of record elevation from the shoreline jurisdiction. The second option would be the board could also consider, in addition to removing that, also remove the entire floodplain in shoreline jurisdiction and only use the what's minimally required by ecology. On that first point, we do believe we heard a preference from the board last time to exclude the flood of record from shoreline jurisdiction, but conversation kind of got cut short for time, and so we wanted to come back and confirm that was the board's direction. It also leaves the question out there for the floodplain itself. So I put some considerations up here from the briefing document to help guide your discussion. Some things to point out are that currently the entire 100-year floodplain is currently in shoreline jurisdiction, but the flood of record is not. Also, regardless of the decision here from the board.
Wait, I'm sorry,
Oh,
can you
yeah.
just repeat that?
Sure. So today, the 100-year floodplain is in, flood of record is not. If you look at a shoreline jurisdiction map as we have it mapped today, it would include the floodplain but not the flood of record because, there's just based on the allowances in state law. So at the time in 1990, we were able to bring in the floodplain. I think the whole piece about critical areas has come along since that time. So it's a product of its time. The board has different decision points that they may make with this update.
And, okay. I feel like I was feeling like to just remove the flood of record and keep the floodplain, which is kind of status quo, addresses the concern we heard and still covers that. I mean, it's the majority of the area that's still within critical area.
Yeah, so anything, it's not like someone's gonna be able to build something where they couldn't today. It's all gonna be still regulated. It's just a question of, which pieces go with critical areas, which pieces go with shoreline. So you're not losing regulation of a flood hazard area. It's still gonna be regulated. It's just which document does it.
It's process, I think
It's
is the
process,
big difference
right.
is that if it's in the SMP, which is fine, it will just have that extra layer and extra time of Department of Ecology review versus
Right.
something that falls wholly within the critical areas ordinance. It would just be local review without that extra Department of Ecology review on top of it.
Do we know, so in that triangle that you outlined, you said that was Polaroid. Do we know, there's another couple big teal, I'll call it,
Yeah.
swaths. Do we know what land that is or who owns it or what's being done there?
I think and I believe we have some representatives here who could potentially speak to that. But, so this is the property that we're talking about. It's all of this. And you can see there are portions that are covered by the 100-year floodplain, so are currently subject to shoreline jurisdiction. There are additional areas on the property that would be covered by the flood of record. So again, they're regulated today by critical areas. The concern is that these areas would come into regulation under the SMP.
And then that requires the ecology,
If there's a variance or a conditional use permit, yes, it would require ecology approval.
which they don't need at this point.
Correct.
But what I was asking is the big teal chunks to the right
Mhm.
of,
I
That
don't know
triangle.
who owns those, but we
Okay.
could certainly find out, but I don't know.
I was just curious if it was all one thing versus, it's like there's a couple parcels.
A clarifying question. So the 100-year floodplain is current in the current SMP.
Correct.
So a question before the board, not only is the maintaining that 100-year floodplain in the SMP, but the addition of the flood record.
Mhm.
So if the board provided direction to remove the 100-year floodplain, that would retract basically the hatch marks to the shoreline jurisdiction, basically, of that 200 feet or
It's
whatever.
the floodway of your water body plus land 200 feet contiguous in the within the floodplain. That's the bare minimum ecology jurisdiction.
Well, I
Right.
guess the question being then, if that was retracted to there, then that would be those permits that would need to have the ecology involvement.
Right.
But we could potentially streamline such that that larger area would fall under the CAO, and just have county review and oversight, which could be
Yeah.
less steps or involvement for the applicant.
And there are quite a few parcels there that are pretty far away from the
Yeah,
actual
this
floodway.
area that we're looking at here, it's roughly, I don't know, 8/10 of a mile or something like that from the Nisqually River in this direction, and then McAllister Creek up in this direction is also a good deal away. So it's a pretty wide floodplain.
Part of
In
the
this
questioning
instance.
is potential streamlining for the applicant.
Right.
I wrote in my notes from the last session, ecology questioning it themselves.
Yeah,
What does that
so,
mean?
and that had to do with the flood of record piece, because Thurston County goes above and beyond what a lot of jurisdictions do when they regulate frequently flooded areas. I don't know that all jurisdictions, well, they don't all look at that flood of record. A lot of them use the FEMA piece. So we go above and beyond in our flood regulation. That's part of why we're a was it CRS
Community
2,
Yeah, although we did
rank 2,
confirm,
whatever it is.
whatever decision you make here, we confirm that it would not change the rating, like our
Yeah, right,
rating is
right.
not tied to.
Thank you, I remember asking that question.
Yeah.
and I forgot
But
that I-
yeah, ecology's specific point is you're taking a document, a regulatory program that's intended for these water bodies, and with this decision to bring all these critical areas in, are putting, regulations on water dependent uses a mile from the shoreline. That's kind of their scratching their heads about that. So I think they know that county has the authority to do so under the ability to bring critical areas and their buffers into shoreline jurisdiction. But in this specific exercise of that allowance, I think they have some questions. So I think we will potentially get some comments about that when ecology reviews the document if no changes are made. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but I just,
Did we get public comment asking us to remove the flood, the 100-year, no, I'm sorry, I'm getting them mixed up. The flood of record?
Mhm.
versus somebody saying, no, I need all this to be out of there. 100-year floodplain as well.
I think the comments in question were related to the flood of record. I think there is, I would say is certainly a sentiment from certain members of the public that, you know, any expansion of area subject to this master program is of concern to them, so.
But there were specific folks who specifically
Said
had
flood of
interest
record,
in
right,
that inclusion.
correct.
So let's go ahead with decision point 1, which is whether to include the flood of record within shoreline jurisdiction. Commissioner Menzer,
I'm gonna go no on that.
and for me as well.
So exclude flood of record, okay, thank you.
And then decision point is the 100-year floodplain, and I have questions about this because I remember the flood of record conversation very clearly at the last meeting, but I'm struggling with the 100-year floodplain. And could you kind of review that once more and?
Yep. Sure. So the Shoreline Management Act lays out what is the base or bare minimum of what needs to be regulated by a master program. And as you know, it's Puget Sound, it's the large lakes, it's the large streams. In addition to that, there are other pieces that they require to be regulated. Associated wetlands is one. Another one is the floodway of any of these shoreline water bodies and land that is 200 feet landward of that floodway within the floodplain. So the bare minimum related to floodplains that the county would be required to identify and protect in the SMP is the floodway that's mapped and 200 feet landward, you know, within the floodplain. The county also, and so that's bare minimum. There are also allowances under state law that allow the county to include critical areas that are associated with these water bodies within shoreline jurisdiction. Let me back up. So in addition to that bare minimum floodway plus 200 feet, the Shoreline Management Act says jurisdictions may include their whole floodplain essentially. So that's one decision point that that counties have. And then separately, there's a broader, you know, counties may bring in critical areas and the buffers necessary to protect them into shoreline jurisdiction. And so through a combination of those two allowances under state law is how we ended up with a proposal that went forward through the process to bring in all those frequently flooded areas into jurisdiction. But as we've said, you know, the board can kind of pick and choose or make different decisions based on the authority you have under state law.
And historically, it sounds like floodplains were included because we
Correct.
didn't have the critical areas ordinance, and so the SMP was sort of acting as a critical areas ordinance as it pertained to
Right.
protection of floodplains.
Right.
But now we do have a critical areas ordinance, so those floodplain areas have a whole nother set of regulatory provisions that would apply to them, regardless of whether they're included in the shoreline master program.
Do you have a map that shows the difference between the flood plain as it's included and the minimum ecology floodway plus 200 feet?
I don't. We
Okay.
can, I could show you, here's what your floodplain looks like, here's what your floodway looks like, and you could make some inferences as
200
to that. We could do that, but we don't have it
I'm
specifically.
just curious if it's, how much overlap is there?
It's gonna depend on the specific river system. So in some places, the floodplain or floodway is larger, in some places it's smaller, and then depending on your surrounding topography, as we know, some if it's flatter area, like, you know, getting out toward the delta, like we have here in the Nisqually Valley, it's gonna be spread out far and wide, but further back in the system where it's more channelized, that floodplain might be smaller because all the water's being carried in a ravine.
Are you showing us Nisqually Valley? Because that's kind of the most expansive.
I'm sure,
Spot.
well, that's specifically where these comments came from.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think I did have another example from the previous presentation, but I took it out because I feel like that was confusing to have one that was unrelated, but was just trying to show another example of how these different areas look.
Why do we need to have the 100-year floodplain in the SMP?
Well,
We don't.
don't have to, but the thought is that you're having one regulatory program cover a property versus saying, you know, the portion that's within 200 feet of the water is covered by shorelines and the rest of it is covered by critical areas ordinance. So it's for regulatory ease and implementation ease, but it is certainly not required.
So what do you mean by regulatory ease?
Just, it's easier for the county to implement. It's one, and it's easier for the public to know that there's one regulatory program that would cover the property versus I need a critical area permit and I need a SMP permit. And you know, if you're at odds with those programs, you need a reasonable use or a variance or both. It's, you know, one permit system versus two permit systems.
Okay.
And there's pros and cons to, you know, each approach.
Can you
And I,
list some pros
yeah,
and cons?
well, I think it really applies to those properties that are within that, the 200 feet of the
Mhm.
floodplain directly adjacent to the floodway. We can have conversations with legal counsel about whether if you are sort of split between SMP and CAO, whether SMP would just cover on that one piece. But otherwise it does create some confusion, you know, to have that. And then aside from, when you're outside that 200 feet, those properties, I think are the ones that would have that additional process that they wouldn't otherwise have. Because without the SMP, they would just be CAO. It's not like they're split between them.
Yeah, that is something that our attorney suggested the board could consider is giving folks the opportunity to opt in if they're in a property that would be covered by both, to, in those instances, have that jurisdiction for SMP just cover them. Which is something the board could explore, but
Which is sort of this middle ground where you alleviate this concern that staff had about having two totally different sets of provisions apply to the same piece of property. And then also allowing properties that are further away from the actual river just fall under the CAO. But those changes would be in the SMP if you wanted to go down that road, and we have not drafted those up. We'd have to bring those back at another scheduled briefing if you wanted to explore it.
Or you have a question, Robin?
I'm just trying to understand it. So currently we have the 100-year floodplain in our SMP,
That's
our
correct.
current SMP. And if the board chose to take it out, that would be a change that would then result in some number of parcels being split, where if they wanted to do something with that parcel, they'd have to consider both regulations, the
Yeah.
SMP and the critical areas.
as you got closer to that water body and you ran up against the minimum shoreline jurisdiction, you'd have parcels that are kind of split.
That are not split now.
Correct. Yeah, the only split that happens now is in between the whole floodplain and the flood of record, because flood of record is currently, but we've just negated that because, well, the board just negated that, so,
Right.
yeah.
There will always potentially be a jurisdictional regulatory split.
So would you say that should the board decide to remove the 100-year floodplain, that there would be a lot of these parcels that would suddenly be split that aren't now?
We'd have to go back and look at that, but I think it could potentially be substantial because you're talking about a large number of streams subject to this master program. And
So you could be creating an additional burden on a substantial number of properties.
well, not necessarily because another wrinkle, as we know right now, we do have these areas. So just because the floodplain is currently in the SMP, doesn't mean those areas are not also subject to the critical areas ordinance. Right today, they're subject to both. That's what we're trying to
Today they're
fix.
subject to both.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're already subject to both. What we would be doing under your example is there would be some areas that would still be subject to both, and there'd be some that would not be. If the board went with whole 100-year floodplain in, then anyone within the floodplain of a shoreline water body is gonna be subject to the permitting standards of just the SMP.
But that doesn't eliminate the potential for a split parcel,
Right.
because it's
Because the
just,
flood
you're
of
just
record.
shifting
Because of
that
flood of
further
record.
away
Yeah. Mhm.
from the main
Right.
water body.
Right.
And that's where we had chatted with legal counsel about, is there a way to just have SMP be the regulatory provisions if there's a split. So essentially, with parcels with a split, automatically they get put in the SMP bucket, so that you don't have this situation of property owners having to get through two different sets of regulatory provisions.
But that's a pathway that could be available regardless of whether or not you include the 100-year floodplain.
It could be. Because the flood record is also gonna create a similar situation. So all that to say, we're trying to keep in mind what the end goal is, which is making it easier for property owners and the staff to navigate all these different permit processes, and we think we have found one, regardless of what decisions you make with the flood of record and the floodplain, inclusion or not inclusion.
Is this like with Ecology's comment on this, is this one where they were like, we're okay with you doing this, but we really kind of recommend or suggest this? Or is it one where they were like, we recommend just the 200 feet and we're not sure why you guys are wanting to, I mean, you know what I mean? Like, sometimes they were like, this is the bare minimum,
Yeah.
but this is our suggestion. I mean,
Would it fall under required change or recommended change?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, they recognize that we have the ability to bring in critical areas, and they recognize that we regulate all these frequently flooded areas. I think they're trying to make sense of those two pieces together, because not all jurisdictions regulate as much as we do related to flood, and not all jurisdictions wanted to bring all their critical areas in. So they're just looking at the process and decision-making and
there's that
reconciling those
flexibility,
things. So,
yeah.
and we'll
Well,
hear more about it.
I mean, I know that we're chewing up time on this. I don't have a strong opinion about this, so, you know, if I guess my personal inclination would be to remove the flood of record and then just keep the flood plain, because that's kind of how we're doing it now, and we'll see what Ecology says to our draft or whatever, but rather than trying to unwrap it. I don't feel strongly enough about it to think that I want to unwrap it and create a new setup, but I could be persuaded if you feel differently.
Well, like, for me, I guess I'm trying to find on like why keep it in, right? And you're saying it's because of a permitting and ease of permitting. But if a property owner still has that split designation, he's still gonna have to go over those two hurdles of a critical areas ordinance and an SMP, regardless of whether this is included or not.
It's gonna depend on, are they entirely within the floodplain, or are they, outside the floodplain but still covered by flood of record? If you're based on the decision the board has made, if you're solely in the flood of record area, you're only gonna be regulated by the critical areas ordinance. If you're in the floodplain, it's a question of, if the board keeps the whole thing in, you're only subject to the SMP. If the board shrinks it to the minimum, it's gonna depend on how close you are to the water. Because you could be in an area where you're in the floodplain, but you're 800 feet from the floodway, and you're good, you're only on the CAO. But if you're closer, it's gonna be potentially both. It just depends on who has the property where that split occurs, and who finds themselves smack in the middle versus they're on one or the other.
You said the planning commission had a short discussion. This wasn't a part of the minority report or anything like that?
I don't think so.
They were kind of agreed
I don't
on
think
it.
so. Yeah, I think they had questions about whether they could, change any of the critical area rules as these things were coming in, and the answer to that was no, that was outside the scope. But we talked about it conceptually, and we explained, why we would bring certain critical areas in, just to have this, one regulatory program cover all these areas that often you find together. And I don't think there was specific conversation, at least not rising to the level that I'm remembering it, like I do some of the other topics, on that particular item.
It's a,
This one is, I'm just, can
the
we,
arguments don't seem like super
yeah,
compelling
like,
either way.
either way, it's just, it seems,
Folks will be impacted one way or the other. It's just where do you draw the line?
Right.
So, and the magnitude of that impact would have to be, analyzed, through some type of GIS experience.
What's that opt-in method that you mentioned? That
So-
sounded like a middle ground. Is that a middle ground or no?
It could, and it's still gonna beg the question of where you have that cutoff of SMP versus CAO. The middle ground would be for properties that find themselves in the situation where they have both of those layers, that we could opt them into SMP so that they're only subject to one program and not having to deal with two different sets of permits and all of that. But that still is gonna beg the question of where does that cutoff line occur? Does it occur at the outer boundary of the 100-year floodplain, or does it occur 200 feet from the floodway as the minimum jurisdiction requires?
Because as is now, if you're split flood of record and floodplain, you still might want to use
Mhm.
an opt-in so that you don't have two sets of permissions.
Here's what I think that we're struggling with is when we're talking about, okay, this is gonna be easier to administer or implement, if that's the argument. And then it's like, well, and it'll be easier for the public to understand. I think the staff and the public are kind of in different situations, because to me, this is complex enough that no public's gonna understand this. I mean, maybe somebody, but by and large, no one's gonna understand this. So if staff understands it, they're gonna have to come to you anyway to figure out. And then there's that overlapping question of, you're saying, well, if there's one scheme, it's easier. But is it easier if that one scheme requires them to go to ecology and wait for a permit that they wouldn't have to wait for if they didn't
Exactly.
have to do that? So it may be that they don't know what's going on. They come to staff tells them, okay, there's two, or whatever, but they can work more efficiently through staff. And ultimately that, even though they didn't understand it at the beginning, it's ultimately easier for them to navigate that process than having one that might be a little simpler, but it actually requires more bureaucracy or whatever, time and delay and all that. I don't know how quickly ecology turns these sorts of things around, but I know that was a consideration Commissioner Edwards brought up as well. So, I mean, there's different elements of like what's easier to administer. Now, if you're telling me that our staff is gonna really struggle and potentially make mistakes and not well, then that's something for us to think about, because that's not good. We need it to be clear and enough that the right advice is given, the right decisions are made by our staff. But if it's really just a matter of, well, our staff will have to work a little harder, they'll figure it all out, get it right. It's gonna be harder for the public, but it's ultimately gonna be easier for them to navigate, then maybe that's.
Yeah, I think to your point, I mean, there are certainly flip sides to these coins, right? So maybe it's great, there's one program that regulates these areas, but the flip side of that is you've now put these areas subject to the SMP, which means it's subject to ecology decision-making, and also increasing the amount of area that we have to demonstrate no net loss and those sort of things. And I wanna say it's not insignificant. I mean, we're adding probably 60 days to permit approvals, because anything that has to go to ecology for approval, we have to wait until all local appeal processes lapse, like we wait 21 days or whatever that is until it didn't get appealed, and then that decision goes to ecology and they do their decision-making process, and then the decision isn't final till their appeal period is concluded. So anything that requires that, it's probably a couple month time that we're adding on.
So then,
So I think you have a situation where ecology doesn't really seem to be asking for the floodplain to be included.
Mhm.
And it adds more process for property owners.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally offer my opinion. I don't hear any argument really that advocates and would tip the scale for the inclusion of the 100-year floodplain as well. I think the ease of regulation it all depends on the magnitude. It's going to be the same regardless, as it's a line on the map, right, in terms of how many are in or out. I would argue that the fewer parcels that are subject to the ecology review, et cetera, makes more sense, and just leaves it solely within the county's jurisdiction under the CAO.
I would agree with that.
yeah.
Is that gonna be,
So, am
how
I hearing
difficult
to-
is that gonna be to accomplish?
We'll figure it
Yes.
out. We'll have to, we'll have to make changes on the maps, and that's part of the package that gets submitted to you. But, I mean, we can work with that, or we can potentially submit a draft map. We'll figure it out. But what I'm hearing from the board, just for clarity, is to go ahead and exclude the flood of record and to go to the minimum required jurisdiction for floodplains required under the SMA. That's what I hear. Is that right?
So, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so exclude the flood of record from shoreline jurisdiction and also only regulate the minimum required areas under SMA as it relates to the floodplain.
So it would not include the.
The 100-year
Yeah,
floodplain.
not the whole
Wouldn't include the
100-year
whole-
So
floodplain,
exclude
go to
and
the
exclude.
minimum required.
Would be those
Yeah.
two.
Because it's not
And-
ultimately changing the critical area ordinance
not.
requirements.
It's not, these areas are gonna continue to be subject to those
Just make
rules.
it simpler. It's
Yeah.
complicated.
And it won't affect our national flood insurance.
Nope. And I mean,
Policy.
maybe if we were a jurisdiction that didn't have a strong critical areas ordinance, this is something that you might want to consider, but since we have such a robust critical areas ordinance, and that's what our flood hazard rating is tied to.
Alright. Okay, moving on. One more topic.
20 minutes for aquaculture.
Alright. Yeah, easy. Okay, so moving on, the last piece we have here is aquaculture. Aquaculture is defined in the Shoreline Master Program and the state regulations as the culture or farming of fish, shellfish, and other aquatic plants and animals. Aquaculture operations can be found in many areas of Puget Sound, including in Thurston County. The Shoreline Management Act and the state guidelines for SMPs consider aquaculture to be an activity of statewide interest, and also is considered a preferred use of the water area when it's conducted consistent with control of pollution and prevention of damage to the environment. Aquaculture is a use that's regulated by the SMP, and the draft SMP incorporates standards for aquaculture that are consistent with the state requirements. So permit and development standards for aquaculture are located in chapter 19-600 of the draft SMP, and the policies are located earlier in chapter 19-300. The draft SMP lays out all the information that applicants are required to submit so that the county can evaluate a proposed aquaculture operation. The SMP requires that new aquaculture uses do not result in a net loss of ecological function or impair navigation or other water-dependent uses. The SMP lays out the requirements that speak to many aspects of aquaculture operations, such as impacts to the environment, visual impacts for surrounding landowners, methods of construction and materials used, and disposing of waste from those operations. In addition to the county SMP, aquaculture is also regulated by several state and federal agencies and is subject to concurrence with tribal treaty rights for harvesting shellfish. I won't read off all the pieces here, but I just wanted to give some context about the regulatory environment for aquaculture. A new use is required to get oversight from any number of state and federal agencies, in addition to the county's SMP. So this is a topic that's been of keen interest to the public throughout the process. The Planning Commission spent a good amount of time on this, and the board also received numerous public comments during the public hearing process. Planning Commission also had Ecology come and on at least one occasion give presentations on this topic. So people commented on how aquaculture operations are monitored, the methods that are used in aquaculture, impacts to the environment, including the things that we simply don't know, and the use of plastics, and among other topics. So the board asked staff to review what other jurisdictions do and how they regulate aquaculture. So we took a look at Pierce, Kitsap, and Mason County Shoreline Master Programs. Generally speaking, they all regulate aquaculture as they're required to under state law and include the requirements that are intended to accommodate aquaculture and also protect the environment, navigation, and aesthetics for surrounding areas. The specifics really vary by jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions have stronger permitting requirements, for example, such as requiring a conditional use permit for all aquaculture. And depending on what aspect of regulation you're looking at, jurisdictions really vary on the specificity of their regulations and what they actually allow or prohibit. My observation was that when you really zoom in and start looking at the requirements of the different jurisdictions, there is no one uniform approach. So we wanted to show some areas where the specifics of the county's draft SMP differ from what you see in other jurisdictions. a couple things to keep in mind with this list here are that a permit can be conditioned with additional requirements beyond the letter of the SMP to control impacts associated with a specific proposed aquaculture operation. Also, as I mentioned, this is a use that is regulated by many other jurisdictions, so just because something is not required by the county doesn't mean it would not be required by another entity in order to have that operation be permitted. And so some specific areas that are different across various counties are how these jurisdictions manage the debris that can be associated with aquaculture operations, how neighbors are notified about ongoing operations, how these operations are monitored and any financial sureties are applied, the use of supplemental feed and chemicals in aquaculture operations, how the SMPs deal with impacts on water quality and aquatic vegetation, and other impacts to surrounding landowners. And I can go back to that screen, but really all that preceding information is just intended to tee up a conversation with the board. Are there any additional changes the board would like to explore or discuss in the draft related to aquaculture based on your review of public comment and the information provided?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Munson?
A lot.
So one of the things we heard the most about, I think, was use of plastics, and I didn't see that on your list of things that other jurisdictions do.
Yeah, there are no outright prohibitions of plastics in any of the jurisdictions that we looked at.
Outright prohibitions, but are there any, I mean, what else?
I didn't really see anything that spoke to specifically the use of plastic. There are different jurisdictions that say, you need to stamp all your equipment, you need to show us and demonstrate how you're gonna prevent it from escaping from the operation, you need to patrol the beaches, those sorts of things. But really, there was nothing in there that said you cannot use plastic or you have to limit the use of plastic or anything like that.
Is there anything, one of the things that caught my attention was when somebody said that, like, I wanna say it's Eld Inlet is like 93%, of the shoreline is like in active aquaculture production. And so is there any point where it gets to be a cumulative impact, right? Like here, there is fine, but once you just like line the shoreway from tip to tail, there's an impact. I mean, is that part of the science? I mean, is there any information that we should be, if that's true, should I be concerned that 93% of Eld Inlet is in, got lined with plastic tubes for gooey ducks or whatever it is?
I think that's something we don't know. I think, and that's been one of the interesting and frustrating things about this particular topic is that there is a lot that we don't know. We're required to accommodate aquaculture and we are also required to, regulate the potential impacts of that activity, but there's no hard and fast rules that say, there's a tipping point in any one basin. If you go over 90%, like 90 is okay, 95 is not okay, or it really should be 50. We don't know.
So, for me, if you were gonna bring forward like, oh my gosh, there's some science that says X and Pierce County did Y and that's really working. My mind was open to hearing a solution, but I was predicting that I wasn't gonna hear anything definitive. And it's just too big of a topic to address, I think, based on what we've gotten from the planning commission and the draft and et cetera. So my suggestion was, in terms of dealing with this topic, was going to be, could we explicitly put into the code or the plan, as we have with no net loss, a specific directive to the Marine Resources Council to study the science and develop a set of recommendations to the board related to aquaculture practice and, ecological, kind of kick the issues to the Marine Resources Council to work on. Because I don't want to let it go, because I think there's a lot there, but I just don't see another practical way for us to address it at this juncture.
I think you could certainly do that. I would also say, in addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, the parameters on that committee and the no net loss monitoring of the draft are written open-ended. So as we discover different parameters we want to explore or tweaks to how we do those things, the county can do that. So I think you could give that committee that directive. You could also give them a directive to develop specifically monitoring parameters for no net loss related to aquaculture. Does And so that, kind of two-step approach.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be open to suggestions, but I would like it to be in there just so the public that's very concerned about this understands that we're gonna keep this conversation moving and continue to study science, and they understand that the board's not sloughing it off, the concerns. We just don't know quite enough about the right policy that would be appropriate. I don't know. Just a suggestion.
That's a good suggestion. I mean, I was gonna ask in terms of any of the requirements here, are there any that, are not basically monitored by the state or the federal government? Like, is the requirements to describe methods to prevent equipment escape and to patrol for debris, for example, because that's something that is not monitored by the state and the federal government, and that just adds additional.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. I think you have these local jurisdictions that wrote their regulations in a way that, were adapted to their local circumstances or the conversations that their decision makers had and things that they wanted to ensure that they were regulating. But, there are other layers of oversight and things that these operations have to achieve in order to get their federal or their state permits. And some of those other entities do monitor various aspects of these operations. So it really is it's a complex regulatory layer. I would have to go back and look at the requirements of all those different permits to see for any one of these things if it's required or not. I think if there's anything, what you're seeing here in this bulleted list are things that, Thurston County kind of differs from what we saw in other jurisdictions. So if it's things that if you want to be sure, we could tweak some language and address some of these pieces, because without going back and researching, I don't know, what the net is there for catching that.
Thank you. I guess I'll turn to Rob and ask about his previous hat that he wore. And Kitsap County was one of the SMPs that was looked at, and I'm wondering, right, like, when you place those additional agriculture, like, what was the goal? Like, what had, did you achieve something basically, kind of?
I think the overarching concept behind that was really trying to put the onus onto the applicant, the business, to actually do that monitoring and to mitigate any potential impacts there would be to the surrounding area, the neighbors, the environment. And it's been a few years since, because I think that a lot of those went into effect with the 2012 update in Kitsap.
Okay.
And then there was just a light refresh not too long ago, but
We're pretty close to Kitsap. Actually, Kitsap County was the kind of the model that the Thurston County SMP was based on. So we're most alike with what Kitsap County has adopted. We wanted to look at something that was a county that we could say is kind of comparable to our situation and had also been approved by ecology. So that was a good starting place to work with. And so I'd say we're the most similar to Kitsap.
Didn't Pierce do something and then get in trouble for doing it with
Yes.
respect to aquaculture?
Yeah, Pierce County got appealed by the shellfish industry, and ecology also did, allowed those things to get through. So I think they were roped into that as well. And that's definitely something that we looked at, and we prepared. I went and worked with our legal counsel and tried to make sure that anything that we were putting forward would not go into that trap of whatever it was that got them appealed. I think they tried to put some pretty big restrictions on aquaculture and, prohibit it entirely in certain SEDs and things like that. It's been a long time since I've looked at that case, but there's a number of very specific things that they were called out on and lost, and ecology implicated along with them for not, stopping that. And we hopefully do not go into any of those pieces because we've looked at that issue. And as I mentioned, our legal counsel has looked at the SMP recently, and I specifically mentioned the aquaculture piece again, and I don't think there are any concerns that were in jeopardy there.
So we have things in place in this draft to address aquaculture, but potentially could include then a directive for the committee to actually do some type of look at sort of how are those regulations. I guess the question to the board would be what period of time in terms of, because it's always looking back as to what aquaculture has been permitted, to be able to say, you know, what metrics are used and how do we know whether or not this program, this construct is actually having an impact. But I don't know the amount of permits that are coming through that volume.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like
I
a
don't
good-
know the level, I mean,
It seems like a good recommendation to have, say, you know, there's that forward-looking, we're going to do a deeper dive on this topic to see sort of where we're at. Not every jurisdiction has a committee really to look at the S&P, so that's a
Yeah, I think aquaculture is an interesting beast on its own, just because of the different regulations. But also, I think we received so much public comment in regards to this specifically. But just looking at the recommendations up there, right, it's like I'm having issues just even pulling some and so I'm very leaning towards Commissioner Mentzer's recommendation to having the committee look over this and see, you know, one is Eldon, are we currently at 93 and then all of a sudden we're gonna be at 95, 97 percent? Tracking that, but also seeing, is there other areas that we can put in certain regulations where we have some flexibility as well, that maybe are not being monitored by the state or the federal government. Because looking at this now, I don't know what is being monitored by the state already or federal government.
Okay, well, I'm thinking about, best available science and actually looking prospectively as well as retrospectively. I mean, I'm not a salmon scientist. I do sit on the Salmon Recovery Council and I learn things along the way, but I've seen gooey duck tubes in the thing and I know eelgrass and all that, kelp, and there's certain plants that are important for the forage fish, for the salmon, juvenile salmon, and I can't imagine that having 93% of your shoreline, I know that's not, gooey duck's not the only thing that's being produced, so I may not have an incomplete picture, but I don't think it's out of line to sort of be on top of that as a board, and we just don't have that information, and that would be a perfect place for this advisory council to plug in.
I do want to highlight that the SMP it requires applicants to submit, a look at where their operation is going to be, what are the surrounding land uses in the area, what are the environmental parameters in that site. So if there are critical saltwater habitat areas, if there are eelgrass beds, they're required to do mitigation sequencing with that. They're already required to avoid, minimize, mitigate. So there's some of that is in there. I think it's just a question of is it enough? Is it detailed enough? Should it go further? Is it something other entities are requiring? Yeah, I think there's other questions to be answered, but it does speak to some of those things.
Thank you. And then I know Commissioner Edwards was very supportive in terms of, or would support not trying to speak on behalf of him, but he did mention it in previous meetings in regards of the use of plastics in aquaculture farming. And so maybe that's something, not sure if we can ask the committee to look into, right? What are the options for that?
Yeah, there's new stuff. I mean, I heard the lands commissioner give a speech pretty recently where there's gonna be an effort of the Department of Natural Resources to, she called the kelp and eelgrass our submerged forests. And so they were sort of incorporating that space into their efforts to protect and preserve these areas. So there's new stuff coming down and new science and new information that I would like the board to be aware of.
Okay.
And it reminds me of that issue on agriculture where, we knew we had an issue but nobody quite knew what to do, and the Planning Commission called for a deeper dive, as we called it, into the issues. And so that's kind of where I'm at, is looking at, I don't know where the right place is to go, but I'd like to see a deeper dive somewhere, and maybe this Marine Resources Council can be
And I think that's something the board will be able to continue to explore on the other side of adoption here, because like I mentioned, the work of that committee is not necessarily going to require new updates to the S&P all the time. So you'll be able to provide that direction in an ongoing fashion and receive reports and however you lay that out. So. Okay. So for the record, we will move forward. For now, we will move forward with the draft with all the aquaculture pieces as drafted, but expect to have further communication between the board and the Aquatic Resources Committee as it pertains to aquaculture and future discussions that occur outside of the update itself.
I don't know where in this draft the council is. I think we directed that on the no net law. So if there's a way to explicitly say that that's part of its mandate, I would like
absolutely.
to see that.
Yep.
I think the public would appreciate that.
Sure. Will do. All right, so what comes next in the process? We're really at the end of all the substantive review for the board. So that's amazing. Thank you for that. We do have a briefing scheduled December 4th, December 11th. I suppose we can talk internally about whether we actually need to hold those, but meanwhile, just know that staff will be incorporating all the guidance you've given into the document, and we expect to bring back a resolution for the board's consideration on December 12th. And then ultimately would submit that package to Ecology in early 2024, assuming it is approved by the board, and work with Ecology on that.
When will you have for us to review the proposal, like with red line or whatever? Just
It would be probably the week of the 4th.
and you said you had a potential work session set for what date?
For the 4th.
From
Yeah.
9 to 11 on the 4th, as well as the 11th.
So we could, if we have it prepared by the 4th, it's due by the 7th, I think, to the board office. If we have it prepared by the 4th, we can certainly come back and kind of walk through some of those things, or at the very least give an update.
Okay, well, I mean, if I'm getting the draft on the 4th, then maybe, I don't know. I'm sure we can make use of the time.
Yeah.
But
We can do our
I'd
best to do
like to
that
have
before
one more
then.
session
Sure.
before we, go to the actual action, because I'm sure there'll be questions.
Mhm.
Unless we all maybe we could all give the county manager a thumbs up and cancel it, we're all good, but to have a session so that we could
Yeah.
ask whatever questions come up once we see the specifics, it'd probably be very good to have that.
So maybe December 11th, we'll cancel the December 4th one, and then that way we have time to review the document and
Vote on the next day.
If we have it the 4th, we would actually have 2 days before it's due to you to make any last minute changes.
okay then.
And then if you want that,
Well, I was just thinking if we
they'd have to be minor, but
if we can see it before the 4th, but if we can't see it till the 4th, then we won't really have questions
Yeah.
unless Andy walks us through stuff. I mean, we could use a time.
It'll be walking in workshop sort of thing
Yeah.
potentially.
That's fine
Because
too,
we're,
I guess.
how many business days are between now and then? Not
Yeah,
many.
yeah,
Yeah.
I hear you, I hear you. I'm just asking.
For me, it takes a little time to kind of let that information sink in.
Let's just keep them
Yeah, sure.
and then
We'll
that
be
way
here.
we maximize time. There may be questions from new board members.
There may be, and we have a briefing for the two new commissioners on Wednesday to review the SMP and the comp plan. It's not gonna be enough time, but we'll at least start getting them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's
Well,
all.
thank you, Andy. Thank you for going on this path with us. What does that make it? 8?
Mhm.
We're at number 8.
Yeah.
We need to put it on to the board.
Yeah.
Yes.
I never thought we would see the end of it, but we did. So thank you so much for all of your work on this and for
Yeah, of course.
providing all the information we needed. I know it was quite a path to get here, so just thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been how many years?
Yeah, been a number.
Been a few years, so
Yeah.
So,
very much appreciate all
We're
the
just
hard
getting all the
work,
cords.
staff and
We're all
board.
plugged in.
okay, it's 11 o'clock. We're adjourned.